Welcome to her remarkable history. Remember to support, please subscribe. The real cause of death of Bloody Mary. Now Mary I has gone down in history for many reasons. She was the firstborn child of the tyrant King Henry VIII and the half-sister of Elizabeth I. But Mary's most spoken about reason for being remembered is that she was known as Queen Mary I, aka Bloody Mary. Her reputation gave her the brutal nickname because of the persecutions done under her reign against the Protestants of the late 1500s, and it was horrific. Her restoration of Catholicism as England's main religion saw a great deal of Protestants being persecuted at the hands of the Queen, and these public burnings must have been terrifying to witness. Mary's aim was to restore law and order, and the abiding of the Catholic Church by her people. Individuals were expected to follow the rules that Mary set out regarding religion, or they would face the consequences. But with everything Mary had actioned or had authorised under her reign, fate had a funny way of catching up with her. You see, unfortunately for Mary, she died a rather unpleasant death herself. So join us today as we look into the real cause of the death for Mary I. And remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Tudor England was not an era known for its hygiene or clean bills of health. In fact, the time was known for its many contagious diseases, and royalty were not immune to these. Influenza, dysentery, and tuberculosis were just 3 contagious diseases that swept across the land, causing pain, suffering, and death in their wakes. Smallpox was also another disease that would often grace Tudor England with its presence. 2 Tudor royals that suffered from smallpox were Henry VIII and his other daughter, Mary's half-sister, Elizabeth. Both were rather unwell, but both did actually recover. An interesting thought is that during this time, illness was often linked with religion, and illness was looked upon as a punishment from God for your sins. With modern-day medicine and research, as a society we have a far better understanding of illnesses and diseases, but in the time of Mary I, illnesses were blamed on things that we would most likely think to have no bearing. For example, betraying God or the religion of the monarchy. Today we can step into the past and pinpoint what the most likely cause of these illnesses were, be it due to extremely poor hygiene, or infections, or illnesses such as cancer. Mary I was not in particular good health throughout her life. She suffered many different bouts of illnesses, and many of these today would be attributed to the great deal of stress Mary lived with from a very young age. Many would argue that Mary's problems were brought on when her father, King Henry VIII, decided he no longer wanted to be with Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, and sought an annulment. It is then believed that once Mary's father remarried, he did not treat Catherine or Mary very kindly, and Mary, now known to have been a rather stubborn lady in later life, is thought to have had this experience shape her for adulthood and subsequently her queenship. Mary was described by those who knew her as having a loud voice that could carry across the room, but it was also rather deep. Her eyes were a smoky grey, and she had reddish hair and a pale complexion. She's also described as being rather short-sighted. It was then, in the early 1528s, that Mary endured a bout of smallpox and managed to survive this deadly illness. It was then, in early 1528, that Mary endured a bout of smallpox but managed to survive this deadly illness. She also suffered pains in her head and stomach, and was known to be unable to keep food down or ingest food for periods of up to 10 days at a time. The best physicians in the country would have treated her, and she was diagnosed with strangulation of the womb, which then caused problems with her menstruation, causing depression, breathing issues, and swelling of her abdomen. These symptoms would later be linked to her death. She would also suffer with headaches, vomiting, fainting, and melancholy. Mary throughout her teenage years suffered more bouts of illness and complained of headaches and stomachache. Lady Shelton then treated and prescribed Mary with medication, but this worsened Mary's symptoms, and it's believed that they caused an allergic reaction. Mary was then seen by the royal doctor, who informed that Mary would improve, but Mary, although getting better in that instant, would then have the illness reoccur, along with bouts of depression, nearly every spring and autumn. Mary's health then became something of an international conversation. All over Europe, talks of the sickly princess flooded the royal courts. At the time, it was almost certain that Mary would be married off to a prince in order to secure alliances for Henry VIII with other European dynasties and empires. However, her health made finding a suitor for her difficult. In the winter of 1537, Mary then suffered with an illness that was serious again. She was unable to get out of bed, and the royal doctor was called for. She then later suffered from a serious fever that was so bad that many thought she would pass away. It took her a long time to get over this, and although we can criticise Henry VIII for being many things, at this point in time he did take an interest in his daughter's well-being. All the way through to Henry marrying his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, Mary suffered with illness after illness. She was accompanied by bouts of depression as well. She was plagued by fevers, and her mental state was in a decline. Her younger brother, Edward, after becoming king, would not help her mental state. His ideas on religious reforms to convert the country into Protestantism would go completely against what Mary believed in. She was forced to stop attending Catholic Church and desist with her beliefs and faith. She was also made to convert to become a Protestant. Mary's mind would have been reeling, and her stress levels would have been elevating greatly. She later wrote to Edward's council that, "My health is more unstable than that of any creature, and I have all the greater need to rejoice in the testimony of a pure conscience." Mary had been sickly for the majority of her life and faced many mental challenges. After the death of her half-brother Edward, Mary then removed Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, from the throne. In Mary's mind, it was her rightful place to be queen. Mary's health was in a constant decline, and she needed to secure her continuance with an heir, meaning Mary needed a husband, and quick. Mary I would then go on to marry Philip II of Spain. Initially he was a prince, but he would go on to become King Philip II of Spain. To continue the line of succession, a monarch must produce an heir. Henry VIII went mad trying to have a son, and Mary, although she did not go to the same lengths as her father, knew that having an heir was of great importance. But, unfortunately for Mary, it would be through trying to have a child that would cause her a tremendous amount of suffering. Shortly after Mary had married Philip, at around the age of 37, she declared that she was pregnant. She had stopped menstruating, she had gained weight, and also suffered with sickness in the mornings. This was plausible to those at court that the Queen was pregnant, and even the royal doctors believed this. Parliament prepared that if Mary was to die during childbirth, her husband Philip would become regent and rule England, as childbirth was incredibly dangerous. But the baby never arrived. False rumours flooded Europe that Mary had had a son, but in fact she had not. Eventually her stomach and abdomen returned to a normal size, and the swelling had reduced. Mary saw this as a punishment for allowing heretics into her country and for allowing religious crimes to take place. After her phantom pregnancy, Mary then fell into a deep, deep depression, and once Philip left to go to war, her mood worsened. She feared assassinations for retaliation of her policies. She suffered with insomnia, and the severe tiredness caused her to age rather quickly. It was then in 1557 that Mary suffered with yet another bout of a swollen abdomen and stomach. Rumours started but soon died out that she was pregnant. No one believed it to be true, and Mary soon resigned herself to the fact that her sister Elizabeth would be her successor. Mary did recover, but England at the time in the January of 1558 was suffering. They had lost territory in France, and the country was suffering greatly with a famine caused by terrible rain. There was a bad pestilence of influenza sweeping the country at a serious rate, adding to the misery, killing thousands. It was during this epidemic that Mary I would die at the age of 42 at St. James's Palace. You see, Mary had become very weak. The lack of sleep and the depression that she suffered had really taken its toll on her, and the fevers plagued her once again. Mary is also said to have had something called dropsy, which in today's definition means edema, or swelling caused by fluid in your body tissue. It was after Mary's condition worsened that she moved from Hampton Court Palace to St. James's Palace to prepare for her death. Mary's mood had become worse, and this final bout of illness would be the last that she would suffer. She did have moments when she was rational with her advisers and looked to recover, but then, in the October of 1558, it was clear that the Queen was going to die. Her husband Philip II learnt that Mary was on her deathbed, and sent his own doctor to see what he could do to treat her. On the 8th of November 1558, agreements were drawn up that named Elizabeth, her half-sister, as her successor. And then Mary drifted over the next week or so and worsened. Her council awaited her death, but as she got closer, her household began to abandon her, and they went to see Elizabeth to try and gain early favour with the soon-to-be new queen. Mary then went blind, and she suffered greatly. She prayed for her salvation, and for God to look after her. She heard one final Catholic Mass around midnight on the 17th of November 1558, and then, between 4 and 5 the following morning, she passed away peacefully, and the reign of Mary I came to an end. Mary's body was then taken to Westminster Abbey, where she laid in state for 3 weeks. Now, medical experts and historians have argued and discussed the real cause of death for Mary. Could the 2 phantom pregnancies that were described responsible for the early onset of her death? Or did Mary suffer from something much more sinister? From an early age, Mary suffered from stomach problems, and that together with the described swelling of her stomach and abdomen would make one believe that Mary suffered from what one would have referred to as ovarian dropsy, or quite possibly ovarian cancer. Mary's womb was thought to have been filled with large, painful cysts that would swell and cause her tremendous amount of excruciating discomfort, something that would have given the impression from the outside of pregnancy. If Mary had been alive in today's society, then her illness could have been treated with ease, but unfortunately, for poor Mary, she did not. Mary herself labelled her illness as old guest, and it was also considered that she died from the influenza outbreaks sweeping England, but it's clear that her depression and earlier illnesses did not help her. Although Mary is known as Bloody Mary, through the depiction of her actions in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Mary herself did suffer a great deal. Her actions are inexcusable, as are the actions of her father, brother and sister. The persecutions of all those with a religious view that was different to theirs, Catholics and Protestants alike, but nevertheless Mary did suffer. Mary herself was a staunch Catholic, and even until her dying day her religious ideas and beliefs never wavered. She died a Queen of England, a woman of strong principles, but a woman who throughout her life had suffered greatly. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.